On an autumn night in the Oxfordshire countryside, the fog came down so thickly that the world beyond the windows of the Fox and Lantern simply disappeared. The roads were lost. The telephone was dead. And before the night was over, the proprietor of the inn would be found murdered in his private parlour. His door had been locked. No stranger could have reached the inn unseen. And everyone who might have wished him dead was already inside. Somewhere among the quiet guests gathered around the fire was a murderer. And before the fog lifted, one small detail beside the hearth would reveal exactly how it had been done. By the time I first saw the lamps of the Fox and Lantern, the road behind me had already disappeared. I had left London that afternoon with no greater ambition than to be left alone for several days. It was an unusually modest purpose, and one which experience had taught me was considerably more difficult to achieve than it sounded. A friend had spoken well of the Fox and Lantern, a comfortable country inn somewhere beyond Burford, with decent food, deep chairs, and an absence of anything that might reasonably be described as organized entertainment. Those qualifications had seemed sufficient. The motorcar which brought me from the station traveled the last few miles at a pace more suited to a funeral procession than to ordinary motoring. The fog had gathered gradually across the valley, first among the low fields and hedgerows, then upon the road itself, until our lamps illuminated little beyond a short wall of white vapor. Trees appeared without warning and vanished behind us. Once a gatepost emerged so close to the near-side lamp that the driver muttered an apology to it. At last the road curved between two dark yews, and a rectangle of amber light showed ahead. "There she is, sir," the driver said with evident relief. The Fox and Lantern stood low and broad beside the road, built of the pale stone one finds throughout that part of Oxfordshire, though in the fog its walls appeared almost grey. The oldest portion possessed a steep roof and irregular chimneys. Later additions had spread comfortably to either side without making any serious attempt at symmetry. Light shone through small-paned windows. Above the entrance hung a painted sign upon an iron bracket, its Fox and Lantern already reduced by the mist to uncertain shapes. It was not grand. I liked it immediately. The front door opened before I had properly reached it. A tall, spare man of perhaps 45 came down the shallow steps and relieved me of my smaller case. "Good evening, sir. You must be our London gentleman, Edwin Paris." He spoke quietly, with the practiced cordiality of a man who had welcomed travellers for many years, without becoming either servile or familiar. "I believe Mr. Latham has given you number 7. Your larger case will be taken up directly." The entrance hall was warmer than I had expected. A fire burned somewhere beyond an open doorway, and with it came the faint mingled sense of wood smoke, beeswax, and something savory from the kitchen. The floor was dark flagstone softened by rugs. A polished oak settle stood beneath the staircase, and beside the door an umbrella stand held walking sticks of several kinds, among them a handsome Malacca cane with a heavy silver head. Paris set my case down long enough to remove his coat. A considerable ring of keys hung from a leather loop at his waist. He selected one without examination and crossed to a small panelled cupboard behind the desk. "You keep the place under formidable protection," I observed. He glanced at the keys and smiled. "An old inn accumulates locks, sir. Most of them unnecessary and half of them obstinate." A woman passing through the hall with folded linen gave a small laugh. "And the obstinate half are always the doors one wants." Paris turned. Mrs. Pym believes locks possess moral failings. They possess age, Mr. Paris, which comes to much the same thing. Mrs. Pym was a compact woman of somewhere past 50, with an expression suggesting that neither locks nor people were likely to inconvenience her for very long. She nodded to me pleasantly. The service room lock was the worst of them until Mr. Latham finally had it replaced, she said. 7 weeks of peace, and I scarcely trust it yet. Paris lifted his keys slightly. It has behaved perfectly since. That is because it knows I am watching it. She continued towards the stairs with her linen. I followed Paris through the hall. A passage branched away towards what he called the private side of the house. Through an open doorway, I glimpsed a pantry, shelves of crockery, and the edge of a narrow corridor beyond. The place possessed the pleasant irregularity of buildings, which had grown by usefulness rather than design. Kitchen and service rooms that way, Paris said. Dining room through there. The public parlour is beyond the hall. Mr. Latham has his own room at the end of the side passage, though you are unlikely to need to trouble with that. We ascended a staircase polished by generations of boots. My room was at the front, comfortably square and without pretension. A fire had been laid and lit before my arrival. Beside it stood a wing chair, a small writing table, and a brass reading lamp. The bed was broad, the counterpane heavy, and the curtains had already been drawn against the encroaching fog. Paris placed my case upon a stand. Tea is still being served downstairs, sir. Dinner at 7:30. If there is anything you require, ring. Nothing at present. He hesitated at the door. The fog may become rather thick tonight. We have already advised Dr. Carrick not to attempt the road unless it improves. I have no intention of attempting any road. That, said Paris, is usually the wisest policy at the Fox and Lantern. When he had gone, I stood for a moment before the fire. There are rooms which reveal too clearly that they expect a traveller to leave in the morning. Number 7 did not. Someone had placed 2 books upon a shelf beside the bed, neither new enough to have been purchased for effect. A small jug of water stood beneath a clean glass. The carpet was faded near the hearth. Nothing matched perfectly, and everything appeared to have been chosen because it had proved useful. It was precisely what I had hoped for. I washed, changed my collar, and spent perhaps 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing. The luxury of that occupation should never be underestimated. At length the promise of tea persuaded me downstairs. The hall had grown dimmer, though it was not yet 6 o'clock. A young maid crossed before me carrying a tray, balancing cups with the grave concentration of youth entrusted with breakable objects. Somewhere deeper in the inn, a door closed softly. Crockery touched crockery. A clock ticked with slow authority. The public parlour lay beyond a wide archway. Its ceiling was low and crossed by blackened beams. 2 shaded lamps cast pools of amber light upon small tables, while the larger illumination came from a broad stone fireplace where logs burned steadily upon a bed of red embers. Armchairs had gathered around it in the manner of old acquaintances. Newspapers lay folded upon a side table. A gentleman rose from one of the chairs as I entered. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with thick grey hair brushed straight back and the ruddy complexion of someone who had spent much of his life moving between warm rooms and cold yards. "You must be our new guest." "Arthur Latham." His handshake was firm. "I hope Paris has made you comfortable." "Extremely." "Good." "We make no claim to luxury here, but I have always thought comfort the more useful virtue." On that point, we were in immediate agreement. He indicated a chair near the fire, and within a few minutes tea appeared. A brown pot beneath a knitted cozy, thin bread and butter, and a plate of seed cake. I accepted all three without resistance. For a while we spoke of nothing consequential. Latham asked about my journey. I asked about the age of the inn. He gave me an abbreviated history involving coaching traffic, an 18th century fire, and 3 generations of Lathams, all of whom, according to him, had improved the property by refusing to improve it too much. Beyond the nearest window, the garden had almost ceased to exist. When I had entered, I had been able to distinguish the stone wall opposite and one dark hedge beyond it. Now only the glass itself remained visible, faintly silvered where moisture gathered against the panes. Somewhere outside came the muffled closing of a yard gate, so altered by the fog that it might have been 50 yards away or 5. Latham followed my glance. "Thickening. So I see. The road will be useless before long." He said it without concern. I settled farther into the chair and accepted another piece of seed cake. The countryside beyond those windows might, for all practical purposes, have vanished from England altogether. I found the prospect surprisingly agreeable. Tea at the Fox and Lantern possessed the agreeable quality of seeming less a meal than a condition of residence. The pot was replenished before I had quite decided that I wanted another cup, and the seed cake, which had begun upon a respectable plate at the center of the table, diminished with such unobtrusive efficiency that I could not honestly determine how much responsibility was mine. Arthur Latham appeared to regard this as satisfactory. "A man travels badly on an empty stomach," he said, "and thinks badly on an overfull one." "That difficulty," he replied, "has never greatly troubled my guests." There was the first suggestion of humor in his expression, though it vanished almost at once beneath the air of practical attention which seemed natural to him. The public parlour gradually filled as the hour advanced. The first to join us was a young woman whom Latham introduced as his daughter, Margaret. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired, composed, and dressed with the quiet neatness of someone accustomed to attending both to herself and to other people's requirements. "I hope number 7 is warm enough," she said after greeting me. "Entirely. Father has a theory that all bedrooms should be maintained at precisely the temperature he prefers." "Most theories of government begin that way," I said. She smiled. "Her father did not. The difficulty is that people make rooms far too hot," Latham said. "A decent fire is one thing. Roasting oneself alive is another." Margaret glanced at me. "You see." There was affection beneath the exchange, though not submission. I formed the impression that Margaret had disagreed with her father often enough to have become economical about it. A few minutes later, a second man entered from the hall. He was in his early 30s, well built without heaviness, and carried himself with the faint restlessness of someone who disliked remaining in one place merely because custom required it. "Hugh," said Latham. "My son." Hugh Latham greeted me pleasantly enough, then crossed to the fireplace and held his hands toward it. "You've escaped London at the right moment." "So I am beginning to believe." He looked toward the window. Though if this thickens much more, escape from here may prove the greater problem. He took a cigarette case from his pocket. When he opened it, a faint, distinctive scent reached me, dry, aromatic, rather sharper than ordinary Virginia tobacco. Turkish, I asked. Mostly. Father dislikes them. I dislike finding the ash everywhere, said Latham. Hugh struck a match. A distinction without practical effect. He smoked with the easy disregard of a man accustomed to receiving criticism from the same source. When he had finished, he crossed into the hall to fetch something from his coat. Through the open archway, I saw him pause beside the umbrella stand and take up the handsome Malacca cane I had noticed upon arriving. The silver head caught the lamplight as he turned it once in his hand. Margaret looked at it. You do not require that indoors. I know. Then why have you brought it in? Because I paid rather too much for it and enjoy looking at it. That, said Latham, is at least an honest account of your financial principles. The remark was lightly spoken, but Hugh's expression altered. Only for a moment. He returned the cane to the stand. Before either man could continue, Edwin Paris entered with another gentleman. This is Dr. Carrick, sir. Stephen Carrick was a spare, greying man of perhaps 53, with a narrow, intelligent face and the manner of one who had spent many years entering rooms in which people were waiting for bad news. He shook my hand. I had intended to be home before dark, he said. The weather has expressed a different opinion. You will stay the night, Latham said. Carrick glanced toward him. If the fog remains as it is. It will. You have become a meteorologist now. No, an innkeeper. It amounts to much the same thing when people insist upon traveling when they should not. Carrick smiled faintly. I shall bow to the greater science. Their exchange was cordial, but something in its formality interested me. They spoke like men who knew one another well and had recently found reason to become careful. A woman entered shortly afterward from the direction of the writing room. She was perhaps 50, elegantly dressed in a dark traveling costume, with silver beginning at her temples and a composed face which had retained more beauty than softness. Mrs. Evelyn March, Latham said. She inclined her head. We have met before, Mr. Latham. Several times. Mrs. March looked at him. Yes, several. It was a curious correction, not in its words, but in the fraction of silence which followed them. Margaret shifted the tea tray slightly. Another cup, Mrs. March. Thank you. The interruption was enough. Mrs. March seated herself near the window, though there was by then nothing visible beyond it. The fog had become remarkable. The last suggestion of hedge and wall had vanished. The panes reflected the room back at us. Lamps, chairs, the red-gold movement of the fire, faces momentarily doubled against a blank exterior whiteness. From outside came the distant sound of a motor horn. It sounded once, then again strangely muffled. No engine followed. Hugh raised his head. Someone on the Burford Road. Or someone in the yard, Carrick said. That close. In this fog, I wouldn't trust my ears for 10 yards. Paris, who had been adjusting a lamp, glanced toward the window. I've sent George to bring the yard lamps nearer the gate. Latham frowned. Not too far out. No, sir. There was no alarm in the room. If anything, the fog seemed to increase its comfort. The lamps were warmer because the windows were blank. The fire seemed more companionable because the countryside had withdrawn. Presently, Mrs. Pym appeared at the parlour door. "Mr. Paris, the pantry door, if you please." Paris looked up. "The new one." "The very same." Elsie has carried the tray through and shut it behind herself. Margaret laughed softly. 7 weeks of peace." "I said nothing about peace," Mrs. Pym replied. Paris removed his key ring and selected one of the smaller keys. "Coming." I watched them disappear toward the service passage. Latham shook his head. "We replaced that lock because the old one jammed." "And the new one locks too well," Hugh said. "It locks exactly as a lock should. Unless Mrs. Pym is on the wrong side of it. Mrs. Pym has never forgiven me for not ordering another key." "Quite right too," Margaret said. "There is no reason for half the household to carry keys to my private rooms. Paris has one. I have the other. That is sufficient." The subject passed as quickly as it had arisen. Carrick had taken up the evening paper. Hugh wandered toward the bookshelves. Margaret poured the last of the tea. Latham removed a cigar case from his coat. He selected one deliberately, examined it beneath the lamp, and took a small cutter from his waistcoat pocket. Rather than clipping the end squarely, he made a neat, shallow cut at an angle, turning the cigar slightly before finishing the second edge. Hugh glanced over. There are surgeons who take less trouble. There are people who ruin good cigars through impatience. Carrick lowered his newspaper. "I refuse to be professionally implicated." Latham lit the cigar, drew upon it once, and settled back in his chair. The scent was mild and rich, quickly mingling with the fire and tea. For several minutes, conversation drifted comfortably. Margaret spoke of the autumn trade. Mrs. March asked whether the old coaching yard was still used. Hugh complained that his father kept account books which might have satisfied the treasury. "They satisfy me," Latham said. "That is precisely the difficulty. You would find fewer difficulties if you acquired the habit of keeping accounts yourself." Hugh's mouth tightened. Margaret intervened. "Father spends every evening after dinner with those books. I doubt the kingdom is in danger of losing a farthing. I inspect them because someone must." Paris had returned and stood for a moment near the door. Latham looked toward him. "Those repair entries from September, have you put the counterfoils with the ledger?" "Yes, sir." "All of them?" "I believe so." Latham's eyes remained upon him a second longer than the question seemed to require. "Bring them to me later." "Of course." Paris moved away. Carrick folded his newspaper. "You will wear yourself out over pennies, Arthur. Pennies become pounds if neglected. Some pounds take longer to recover than others." The room became very quiet. Latham turned his cigar between his fingers. "I am aware of that, Stephen." Carrick's expression did not change, but he returned his attention to the newspaper without reading it. At that moment, Elsie appeared. Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes, sir. Latham nodded. Thank you. The small company began the pleasant, unhurried business of preparing to move. Hugh extinguished his cigarette. Margaret collected a book she had left beside her chair. Mrs. March rose and smoothed one glove. Paris entered from the hall, carrying several envelopes. One came with the afternoon post for you, Mr. Latham. I found it beneath the booking ledger. Latham took the small bundle. He glanced through it casually until he reached a cream envelope bearing a printed return address. Then he stopped. He opened it with his thumb and read no more than a few lines. Nothing dramatic occurred. He merely became quite still. A moment later, he folded the paper, placed it back inside its envelope, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. Dinner, he said. His voice was perfectly ordinary. Only his face was not. The dining room of the Fox and Lantern was smaller than the public parlour, and to my mind, the better for it. A long oak table would have seemed absurd there. Instead, several square tables occupied the room beneath shaded wall lamps, and ours had been drawn near enough to the fire that its warmth reached us without becoming oppressive. White linen, heavy silver and plain china gave the place an air of careful prosperity rather than display. Outside the windows, there was nothing. The fog had become so dense that the glass appeared backed with grey wool. Once, while we were taking our places, I heard footsteps cross the yard and then abruptly lose all direction. A moment later, the outer door opened and closed somewhere beyond the hall. Mrs. Pym entered, carrying a covered dish. George nearly walked into the mounting block, she announced. Hugh smiled. Again. This time he had a lantern. That hardly improves the story. It did not improve George. She set down the dish and departed with the composure of one accustomed to finding foolishness in men and compensation in properly served food. Dinner began with soup, hot and uncomplicated, followed by roast chicken, potatoes and vegetables, which had plainly seen a garden rather more recently than most vegetables encountered in London. Conversation remained pleasantly general for some time. Mrs. March asked me whether I often visited Oxfordshire. Carrick spoke of a patient who had once insisted upon treating rheumatism with cider. Margaret defended the inn's cook against Hugh's suggestion that the apple tart had become larger every autumn. It is the plates becoming smaller, he said. Then you had better eat quickly before they disappear altogether. Arthur Latham listened to these exchanges with the half-attention of a host whose mind had not entirely followed him to the table. The letter he had received before dinner remained in his inner pocket. Twice I saw his hand move unconsciously toward the place where he had put it. The second time, Edwin Paris noticed as well. He had taken his meal with us at Latham's insistence, though his position at the end of the table gave him a convenient excuse to rise when some matter of service required attention. Each time Arthur's thoughts seemed to withdraw from the conversation, Paris's eyes moved towards him briefly and then away. There was nothing furtive in it. It was merely the attention of an efficient subordinate to a distracted employer. Yet efficiency, like silence, is sometimes most noticeable when one has reason to observe it. Your traveller from Cheltenham never arrived, Margaret asked him. Paris shook his head. No, Miss Latham. I telephoned the posting house before the line became unreliable. He had not left there. A sensible man, Carrick said. Or a fortunate one, said Mrs. March. Arthur looked up. No one should be on these roads tonight unless he has no choice. Hugh carved another piece from his roll. That sounds almost charitable. It is practical. With father, Margaret said to me, the distinction is often academic. Arthur ignored her. His attention had settled upon a small notebook Paris had brought into the room and left beside his plate. Did you find the September account? Paris paused before answering. The repair account. The yard repairs and the south chimney. Yes, sir. And the counterfoils. I put what I found with the ledger. What you found. Paris's tone remained unchanged. There may be one receipt still filed with the builder's correspondence. I shall look again after dinner. Arthur laid down his knife. I should like the figures complete tonight. A silence of perhaps 2 seconds followed. It was Margaret who broke it. Father will spend half the night with those books if someone allows him. I shall spend whatever time is necessary. You said yesterday that the September totals were finished. They ought to have been. Paris lowered his eyes to his plate. I will bring everything to your room, sir. Arthur nodded. The conversation moved on, but not quite as easily as before. Hugh leaned back in his chair. You might occasionally permit the accounts to survive unattended until morning. Arthur looked at him. I prefer to know where matters stand. Yes, in all things. Margaret gave her brother a warning glance. He accepted it with an expression of exaggerated innocence and reached for the salt. Mrs. March, who had so far shown little interest in the subject, said, You have always kept everything, haven't you, Mr. Latham? Arthur turned towards her. Everything. Papers, letters, old agreements, that sort of thing. Her voice was casual, but her fingers had stopped upon the stem of her water glass. Arthur considered her. I keep what may be useful, and what is no longer useful. That depends upon who is deciding. For the second time that evening, something passed between them which belonged to an earlier conversation. Mrs. March smiled. Quite. She resumed her dinner. I noticed that Margaret had noticed too. Carrick, perhaps deliberately, asked Hugh about motor cars. The younger man brightened at once. I've been working with a fellow in Oxford who knows more about gearboxes than is reasonable in one human being. Arthur's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Hugh continued. We've a chance of taking a small workshop properly next month. If you can pay for it, said his father. That is generally how workshops are obtained. Then I suggest you obtain it in the usual manner. The ease left Hugh's voice. I intend to. Arthur said nothing further. For several moments only the sounds of dinner remained, the soft movement of cutlery, the settling of the fire, and somewhere beyond the door, the faint ringing of china from the pantry. Carrick cleared his throat. I believe I owe you an answer myself, Arthur. Latham looked across at him. Carrick's expression had become carefully neutral. I have not forgotten the matter we discussed last week. I did not suppose you had. The delay is temporary. Most delays are described that way. Carrick's mouth tightened. I shall speak to you privately before I leave. You will not be leaving tonight. Before I leave tomorrow, then. Arthur inclined his head. No one asked what the matter concerned. The fog made a small sound against the windows, not rain, but moisture gathering and slipping down the panes. The room felt extraordinarily enclosed. Beyond those walls, there might have been fields, roads, villages, and all the breadth of England. From where I sat, none of them seemed particularly certain. Dessert arrived. The apple tart vindicated Hugh's earlier interest in it. Mrs. Pym served portions with a severity that discouraged negotiation, and for a little while domestic comfort reasserted itself. Even Arthur seemed to relax. He spoke of an old coaching record discovered in the attic and promised to show it to me if I cared for such things. I care for almost anything sufficiently old to have escaped improvement, I said. Hugh laughed. You will get on with this inn. Margaret poured coffee for Mrs. March. Father says much the same about the furniture. The furniture, Arthur replied, has paid for itself. So have I should think. Not yet. There was laughter around the table, though Hugh's was delayed. When dinner ended, Carrick went first towards the public parlour. Mrs. March followed Margaret into the hall. Paris gathered his notebook and spoke quietly to Elsie regarding breakfast. Arthur remained beside the table. Hugh did also. I had nearly reached the door when I heard him say, with an effort at casualness, Father, could I have a word with you? Arthur glanced at him. About the workshop. Yes. For the first time that evening, Hugh seemed uncertain. Arthur took his cigar case from his pocket. Very well. Hugh looked towards the hall, then back at his father. Privately. Arthur regarded him for a moment. Then he nodded. My room. They left together by the side passage. I went on towards the warmth of the public parlour, while behind me the dining room fire settled softly in its grate, and the fog pressed unseen against the windows. The public parlour had altered subtly while we were at dinner. Nothing in it had changed, yet the room seemed quieter. The fire had burned lower, the lamps had acquired a deeper colour, and the windows had ceased altogether to suggest that there was a countryside beyond them. The fog lay against the glass in a blank grey thickness, which reflected only the room itself. Carrick took possession of the chair nearest the hearth. I surrender to Latham's judgment, he said. No road is worth proving oneself a fool upon. Mrs. March smiled. A remarkably inexpensive medical opinion. It is the inexpensive ones which are most often ignored. Margaret had disappeared somewhere upstairs. Paris moved between the hall and dining room with the unobtrusive regularity I had already begun to associate with him. I selected a newspaper and read perhaps half a column before realizing that I had retained none of it. From the side passage came the murmur of voices. Arthur and Hugh. At first, I could distinguish nothing. Then Hugh's voice rose. I am not asking you to throw money away. No, Arthur answered. Only to provide it. You know perfectly well what this means to me. I know what you say it means. There followed several seconds of silence. Carrick's eyes remained on his paper. Mrs. March adjusted one glove. Neither appeared to be listening. Naturally, both were. Hugh spoke again, lower this time, and I caught only the words "mother's money." Arthur's reply came clearly. "It is not yours to squander merely because you have found a more respectable name for speculation." A chair moved sharply. I returned my attention to the newspaper. Private quarrels become no less private merely because doors are old. A few minutes later, Mrs. March rose. "I believe I left my handkerchief in the writing room." No one answered beyond Margaret's empty chair. She went out. It was perhaps 5 minutes before she returned. She came not from the writing room doorway, as I had expected, but from farther along the passage. She paused when she saw me looking up. "These old houses defeat one's sense of direction," she said. "Frequently." She resumed her seat. Her expression discouraged further conversation. Shortly afterward, Margaret came downstairs carrying several folded sheets of paper. She crossed the hall towards the small writing room. The door remained partly open. I saw her sit at the desk beneath the lamp and read one of the sheets. Whatever it contained did not please her. She remained very still for a moment, then folded the page once and held one corner to the flame of a candle. The paper blackened. She dropped the burning portion into the little grate and watched until it curled into ash. She then placed the remaining pages in her handbag. If she noticed me in the parlour, she gave no sign. At approximately 5 minutes past 9, Hugh emerged from his father's room. He had a cigarette between his fingers, though it was nearly finished. The sharper scent of Turkish tobacco preceded him into the hall. His face had lost the easy humour it had worn at dinner. Arthur appeared briefly behind him. "You have my answer," he said. "Yes," Hugh replied. "And I advise you not to make matters worse by behaving like a child." Hugh turned. "For once, father, I should prefer not to hear your advice." He walked away before Arthur could reply. Arthur remained at the door for a moment, then withdrew into his private room and closed it. Hugh stopped beside the umbrella stand. His hand went automatically toward the silver-headed cane, then dropped. He left it where it stood. Paris appeared from the dining room, carrying a small stack of papers. Hugh passed him without speaking. Paris watched him go, then glanced toward the side passage. "I take it dinner has improved no one's temper," Carrick observed. "Apparently not." Hugh extinguished what remained of his cigarette and crossed into the billiard room. For a little while the inn became quiet again. At about 10 minutes past 9, Arthur's bell sounded somewhere beyond the passage. Paris answered it. He returned less than a minute later and spoke to Mrs. Pym, who had emerged from the dining room. "Mr. Latham wants the September repair invoices as well. They are in the household file. And the counterfoils. I thought you had those." "I do." Mrs. Pym gave him a brief look, then disappeared toward the pantry. Paris crossed the hall. As he passed the umbrella stand, he stopped and bent over it. For a moment, he seemed to be rearranging the cluster of sticks and umbrellas. The silver head of Hugh's Malacca cane flashed beneath his hand. Then someone called from the dining room, and my attention moved elsewhere. The hall clock struck the quarter. A few minutes later, Mrs. Pym returned, carrying a narrow bundle of papers. Instead of going directly to the silver cupboard, she continued along the side passage and knocked at Arthur's door. He opened it himself. I saw him take the papers from her and say something which I could not hear. Mrs. Pym answered, glanced briefly towards the service rooms, and then came back the few steps to the tall fitted cupboard opposite his door. Its doors stood open, revealing the glimmer of silver within. She began counting the contents with the grave concentration of a banker examining sovereigns. Paris, meanwhile, reappeared, carrying the account books and counterfoils. Rather than approach Arthur's ordinary door, he passed through the pantry and disappeared into the narrow service passage beyond it. Mrs. Pym continued her work. Several minutes passed. At one point, she stopped with a spoon in her hand and turned her head sharply towards Arthur's room, as though some sound from within had caught her attention. After a moment, she resumed counting. The hall clock struck the half-hour. Mrs. Pym fitted the final tray into the cupboard, closed both doors, and turned the key. The passage was empty again. Hugh reappeared from the billiard room some minutes later. His anger had cooled into something nearer embarrassment. "I owe the room an apology," he said. Carrick looked up. "Which room?" "Whichever one heard me. That may include Oxford." Hugh gave a reluctant laugh. He drifted toward a small chess table near the far wall. "Do you play?" "I have been accused of it." "Would you?" I looked at the clock. It was just past 20 minutes to 10. "I see no reason not to lose honorably before bed." "You assume too much." We arranged the pieces. Margaret joined us for a few minutes, then went to speak with Mrs. March. Carrick remained by the fire. The game began shortly afterward. Hugh played quickly at first, then slowed when he discovered that I did not. "You are one of those men," he said. "What men?" "Those who pretend chess is restful." "I find it restful." "For yourself, perhaps." The game proceeded. Beyond the windows, nothing existed but fog. Hugh moved a knight. "Your turn." I returned to the board. The next half-hour passed quietly. Hugh remained opposite me throughout. Carrick read. Mrs. March and Margaret spoke in low voices near the fire. Paris came and went upon ordinary business. At a little after 10, Elsie crossed the hall carrying a small tray. On it stood a coffee pot, 1 cup and saucer. She had nearly reached the side passage when Paris intercepted her. "I'll take Mr. Latham's coffee." "Thank you, Mr. Paris." He accepted the tray. I thought nothing of it. By 10 past 10, Hugh had lost a bishop and acquired the expression of a man personally betrayed by mathematics. At approximately 1/4 past, Paris entered from the dining room with Margaret beside him. They were discussing breakfast numbers. 6 staying, Margaret said. 7 if Dr. Carrick counts himself among the living by morning. Carrick lowered his paper. "I object to the conditional." For the first time in some while, everyone laughed. A few minutes later, Margaret looked at the clock. Father wanted the cash book before he finished. She rose and crossed the hall. Hugh studied the board. You've trapped my rook. I had hoped you might not notice. I almost didn't. From the side passage came the sound of a door opening. Then nothing. Margaret spoke her father's name. Once. Her voice was not loud. The second time she called him, every person in the parlour looked up. I was already on my feet when she appeared at the end of the passage. All colour had gone from her face. My father. She stopped and steadied herself against the doorframe. He's lying beside the fire. Carrick reached Margaret before I did. He put one hand lightly beneath her elbow and guided her into the nearest chair. Stay here. She shook her head. I ought. No. His tone was quiet, but it admitted no argument. Hugh had already come around the chess table. The expression he had worn over the trapped rook had vanished completely. What has happened? Margaret looked at him. I don't know. That was all she managed. I turned towards the side passage. Dr. Carrick. He understood at once and followed me. The private parlour door stood open. Warm light reached across the passage from within, yellow from the table lamp and deeper orange from the fireplace. It was a smaller room than the public parlour, lined with dark shelves and furnished more for use than display. Account books occupied one end of the writing table. A leather chair stood near the hearth. Arthur Latham lay between that chair and the fireplace. There was nothing theatrical in the sight. He had fallen upon his side, one arm bent beneath him, as though an ordinary movement had been interrupted and never completed. Beside his hand lay Hugh's silver-headed Malacca cane. Carrick knelt. I remained where I was until he had examined Latham, then closed the door behind us. The fire burned unusually high. 3 fresh pieces of wood had been laid upon it, and the flames had taken strongly. The room was considerably warmer than the public parlour. Carrick looked up at me. He is dead. How? He examined the side of Latham's head with professional care. A heavy blow. One would have been sufficient. His voice remained low. Recently. Carrick glanced towards the hearth before answering. Do not ask me for minutes. I wasn't intending to. Good. He rose slowly. The room is very warm. That makes crude judgments from temperature worse than useless. I nodded. There were some conclusions best prevented before they acquired authority. The room itself had the untidy stillness of interrupted routine. A coffee tray stood upon a small table beside the leather chair. I touched the outside of the pot with 2 fingers. It was still warm. The cup had been poured, but apparently not tasted. Its surface remained smooth. In an ashtray beside it lay a cigar which had burned only a little way beyond the lighting. The smell of it was still present beneath the stronger scent of wood smoke. Nearer the desk, I saw grey ash upon a small saucer. It was finer and paler than the cigar ash. Turkish tobacco. I said nothing. Carrick's eyes had gone to the cane. That may fit the injury. Mays. It is heavy enough. I should prefer not to make declarations until I have had a better look. Then don't. He gave me a brief glance of approval. I moved nearer the body without touching it. A watch lay partly beneath the edge of Latham's coat. Its glass was cracked. The hands had stopped a little after 10 minutes past 10, approximately 12 minutes past by my reading. A length of gold chain still crossed Latham's waistcoat. The watch was no longer attached to it. I bent closer. The chain itself did not appear broken. Behind us came a soft knock. Paris's voice. "Sir." I opened the door only far enough to speak to him. "Keep everyone in the public parlour, please. No one is to come in here." His face was pale but controlled. "Of course." "And ask Mrs. Pym to remain available." "Yes, sir." He hesitated. "Miss Latham. Dr. Carrick will speak to her shortly." Paris inclined his head and withdrew. When I shut the door again, ordinary sounds reached us faintly through the timber. A cup being placed upon a saucer, a low murmur of voices, the slow ticking of the hall clock. The inn had not ceased to be an inn. That fact was curiously comforting. I crossed to the window. The curtains had been partly drawn. Behind them the glass was misted at the edges, and beyond it there was nothing but the dense, colourless fog. The latch was fastened. I raised neither it nor the sash. Instead, I looked down towards the sill through the pane. Moisture had gathered thickly outside, beading the stone and the lower frame. There was no obvious disturbance that I could see from within. A second door stood in the panelling near the fireplace. It was narrower than the main entrance and fitted with the newer brass lock I had noticed indirectly during my first evening at the inn. I tried the handle gently. Locked. Carrick joined me. The service door. I believe so. He looked around the room. No sign of a struggle. No. The leather chair remained upright. Papers upon the desk were untidily arranged, but not scattered. The lamp stood secure. Even the coffee tray appeared carefully placed. Only the displaced hearth fender jarred against the room's order. One end had shifted several inches from the stone. Carrick followed my gaze. He fell against it. Possibly. I did not say more. A knock sounded again, this time firmer. Hugh. I opened the door. He stood alone in the passage, though I could see Margaret seated beyond him in the public parlour. Mrs. March had drawn her chair nearer. Elsie was moving quietly between them with a fresh pot of tea, which no one seemed particularly inclined to drink. Hugh looked past me. Is he? Yes. He closed his eyes briefly. How? Carrick answered. A blow to the head. Hugh's gaze dropped. He had seen the cane. For several seconds, he did not speak. Then he said, "That's mine." "I know," I replied. His face changed. "I left it in the hall." "Yes." "I did not bring it in there." "I am not suggesting that you did." "But someone will." The words came more sharply than he intended. From the public parlour, Margaret said his name. He looked back at her and mastered himself. I was angry with him. Yes. I said things I should not have said. I waited. I smoked in there, he added. 1 cigarette. Perhaps 2. Carrick glanced at me. Hugh saw that also. Oh God. No conclusions yet, I said. He looked at the room again. The watch. What time? I hesitated, only briefly. A little after 10:10. Hugh stared at me. Then he turned instinctively towards the chess table visible through the parlour arch. Its pieces remained exactly where we had left them. His trapped rook stood near the edge of the board. We were playing then. Yes. I never left you. No. The hall clock ticked steadily behind him. I looked back into Arthur Latham's room, at the warm coffee, the newly burning fire, the scarcely smoked cigar, the stopped watch, and Hugh's cane beside the dead man. Everything seemed to point in one direction. And yet I knew, with the certainty available only to an eyewitness, that at the time the room appeared to name, Hugh Latham had been sitting directly opposite me. The evidence had accused a man whom my own eyes appeared to acquit. We remained in Arthur Latham's private parlour for several minutes after Hugh had returned to the others. Carrick stood with his back to the fire, not from preference, I thought, but because there was nowhere else to stand without approaching the body too closely. The flames had settled somewhat since our first examination, though the room was still warmer than any other part of the inn I had entered that evening. You were right not to give Hugh a time, I said. Carrick looked at the stopped watch. I could give him several times. That would be equally useless. You believe death was recent. I believe it was not ancient history. That is a generous margin. It is also an honest one. He bent once more beside Latham, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. The blow was severe. Death would have been immediate, or as near to immediate as makes no practical difference. No possibility that he moved about afterward. None that I can see. I looked toward the displaced brass fender. The nearer end stood several inches out from the hearth. There was a faint mark upon the rug where one of its feet had dragged. The fall might have moved that. Quite easily. Carrick straightened. But if you are asking me whether I can tell you precisely when it moved, the answer remains no. I wouldn't insult you by trying again. That produced the smallest suggestion of a smile. Beyond the closed door, the fox and lantern continued in subdued fragments. Someone crossed the hall. A cupboard closed. Farther away came the muted clatter of china being gathered from the dining room. The sounds were ordinary enough, and for that reason reassuring. I returned to the writing table. The account books lay open beneath the lamp. Several loose papers had been pushed to one side. There was nothing sufficiently dramatic about them to deserve immediate attention, and I resisted the temptation to manufacture importance merely because a dead man had been sitting beside them. Instead, I considered the room as a whole. The coffee remained untouched. The cigar had scarcely burned. The watch had stopped at roughly 12 minutes past 10. The fire was strong. Any one of these things might have suggested that Latham had been alive very recently. Together, they encouraged the idea almost too neatly. That thought I kept to myself. I bent over the watch without moving it. The gold chain still ran from the buttonhole of Latham's waistcoat to the small fastening at the opposite end. It was intact. Carrick joined me. That should be attached. Yes. The watch itself lay free. I examined the little ring by which it ordinarily connected with the chain. No break here either. So it was detached. It appears so. Carrick glanced towards the body. By Latham. Possibly. He accepted the answer without enthusiasm. I moved to the ashtray beside the coffee. The cigar there had gone out. Its end had been cut, but not in the fashion I remembered from before dinner. Arthur had taken a curious little care over his cigar then, shaping the end with 2 shallow cuts rather than one blunt clip. This one had been cut squarely. I touched nothing. Carrick watched me. You've seen something. I've remembered something. Which is usually worse. Mr. Latham prepared his cigars rather carefully. Carrick leaned closer. This one. Not in the same manner. He considered that someone else may have cut it for him. Someone may. Neither of us went further. The coffee offered a similar difficulty. It was warm enough that, under ordinary circumstances, I might have guessed it had been poured not long before the discovery. Yet the cup had not been lifted. There was no stain at the rim and no disturbance upon the surface, except the slight skin that had begun to form. I looked toward the fire again. Arthur had complained only a few hours earlier that rooms were too often overheated. This room was close. 3 good pieces of wood had been added recently enough to remain only partly charred. Carrick followed my glance. You are thinking about the heat again. I am thinking that Mr. Latham would have complained of it. That I can confirm. He complained of most overheated rooms. Even his own. Especially his own. I crossed to the window. The latch remained secured. The fog beyond had thickened, if such a thing were possible. Moisture lay heavily along the outer sill, visible where the lamplight reached it through the glass. No clear streak broke the damp surface. I did not attempt to open the sash. The narrow service door beside the fireplace remained locked. For the moment, that was all it needed to be. A light knock came at the main door. Mrs. Pym stood outside. Mr. Paris said you wished me nearby. Yes. Come in, please. She entered, saw Arthur again, and stopped. Her face tightened, though she did not lose control. I am sorry, I said. So am I. Her eyes moved automatically toward the fire. That is far too high. The remark was so immediate that I looked at her. For this room. For Mr. Latham. He'd have had someone's head for wasting logs like that. Carrick and I exchanged a glance. Mrs. Pym noticed. I've said something useful. Perhaps. She looked at the coffee tray next. Elsie brought that. I believe so. She would have prepared it in the pantry. Mrs. Pym did not touch the cup. Mr. Latham took coffee here every night. Near enough. A little after 10. Did he usually drink it promptly? If he was working, yes. Said cold coffee was an insult twice over. There was affection beneath the severity. I thanked her and asked if she would remain with Margaret for the present. Of course. At the door she paused. There is tea in the public room. None of them are drinking it, but it is there. That may be more useful than they think. It generally is. When she had gone, Carrick lowered himself into the chair farthest from the hearth. What now? Now we leave this room exactly as it is. And the others? We speak to them one at a time, without turning the inn into a tribunal. He nodded. I gave the room one final look. The watch said 12 minutes past 10. The coffee was warm. The cigar was newly lighted. The fire was fresh. Yet each fact, examined alone, had already become less certain than it first appeared. I had no answer, but I was no longer prepared to accept the hour simply because the room had arranged itself around it. By 11:30, the chessboard had been moved to a side table. Mrs. Pym had done it herself, not because anyone had asked her, but because the unfinished game seemed somehow indecent where it stood. She lifted each piece into its wooden box, closed the lid, and carried it away with the same practical care she had shown over the silver after dinner. Tea had been replaced by coffee for those who wanted it, though Hugh declined both. He stood beside the bookcase with one hand in his trouser pocket and the other resting against the back of a chair. Margaret sat near the lamp with a folded handkerchief between her fingers. I had suggested that we speak there rather than in Arthur's private room. There was no advantage in surrounding grief with evidence. Hugh, I said, I should like you to tell me exactly what happened between you and your father after dinner. He gave a short breath. You heard enough of it. Enough to know you quarreled. Not enough to know why. Margaret looked towards him. Hugh remained standing. I wanted money for the workshop. How much? £500. Margaret's eyes lifted. You never told me it was that much. There seemed little point announcing it after father had refused. I waited. Hugh went on. A man named Peter Vale, and I have been working towards taking over a small engineering concern outside Oxford. Nothing grand. 2 mechanics, a decent workshop, some repair contracts, and the possibility of building something better from it. Motor engineering. Yes. Your father disapproved. My father regarded motor cars as evidence that mankind had lost patience with horses. Margaret almost smiled. That is unfair. Only slightly. He moved at last and took the chair opposite me. The money was not to pay debts. I am not ruined. I have not gambled it away. There has been some talk to that effect. From your father. From people who know that I ask him for money and conclude the most entertaining explanation. You referred to your mother's money. Hugh looked at me sharply, then remembered that the door had not kept his voice entirely private. Yes. Part of her estate was placed in trust. Father controls it until certain conditions are met. I believed he might release some of it early. And he refused. Completely. How did you take that? Badly. Margaret looked down at the handkerchief. Hugh noticed. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I said he enjoyed controlling people. He said I had mistaken enthusiasm for judgment. I told him he had spent 30 years treating every decision he disliked as evidence of stupidity. And then he became angry. Did he threaten to disinherit you? No. Did you threaten him? Hugh stared at me. No. The answer came without hesitation. What did you do? I smoked. He rubbed one hand over his face. I had already lit a cigarette before the conversation became unpleasant. I may have lit a second. I don't remember. I put one out in the saucer on his desk. The Turkish cigarettes. Yes. So the ash in the room is yours. It must be. Margaret shifted slightly. Hugh continued before I could ask. And the cane is mine. I know how that looks. When did you last have it? Before dinner, I think. Or earlier. I brought it in from the yard when I arrived this afternoon and left it in the hall stand. I picked it up once while we were having tea. I saw you. I did not take it into Father's room. When you left him, it was still in the hall. You noticed it. I remember almost taking it. I was angry enough to want to go outside, fog or no fog. Then I decided that walking blindly into a ditch would merely give Father one final argument in his favor. That was sufficiently like Hugh that I believed he had thought it. What time did you leave your father? He considered. A little after 9. Approximately 5 past. That sounds right. And he was alive and well when you left. Alive and furious. His voice altered on the last word. He looked away. For a time, none of us spoke. A faint sound came from the service rooms beyond the hall, a kettle lid settling, then the careful closing of a drawer. Someone was still completing the duties which an ordinary evening would have required. Hugh looked toward the doorway. I thought I would speak to him again tomorrow. There was nothing useful to say to that. I let the silence remain. After a moment, Margaret rose. May I have some water? I crossed to the side table where Mrs. Pym had placed a carafe and 2 glasses. Margaret accepted one and drank before sitting again. I said, your father was occupied with something besides Hugh's request tonight. Yes. The accounts. She nodded. He had been restless about them for several days. Did you know why? No. Father did not share worries until he had decided exactly whose fault they were. Hugh gave a bleak little laugh. Margaret ignored him. He had spoken of repair bills, banking entries, things not agreeing as they should. Mr. Paris keeps most of the detailed books, but Father checked everything. Was that unusual? The checking? No. The concern was. And there was another matter between you and your father. Her hand tightened around the glass. Hugh looked at her. What matter? Margaret did not answer him. Instead, she looked directly at me. You saw me burn the letter. Yes. I wondered whether you had. Hugh frowned. What letter? Margaret placed the glass down carefully. It has nothing to do with father. That remains to be established, I said. She accepted the rebuke. It was from Robert. Hugh's expression changed again, though this time into surprise. Robert Fenwick. Yes. The schoolmaster. Yes, Hugh. He leaned back. Margaret continued. He has asked me to marry him. I accepted last week. Hugh's surprise softened. And father did not know. Why not? You know perfectly well why not. Arthur, it seemed, had considered Robert Fenwick a worthy young man insufficiently supplied with income, prospects, and perhaps obedience. The letter I burned, Margaret said, was one in which Robert wrote rather plainly about father's opinion of him. I had left it in my bag downstairs. When father began speaking of papers and accounts tonight, I suddenly imagined him finding it. So you destroyed part of it. The part concerning father. I kept the rest. She opened her handbag and produced the folded pages I had seen earlier. I did not read them. Her willingness to produce them was enough for the moment. Your father had also spoken of selling the inn. Hugh looked towards her. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Not immediately, but recently he had begun saying that he might sell within a few years. And you objected. I grew up here. Her answer was quiet. I know every room, every loose stair, every cupboard door which refuses to shut in damp weather. The idea of someone else owning it, yes, I objected. That would give you reason to quarrel with him. It gave me reason to disagree with him. There is a difference. There was no anger in her voice, only weariness. I thought again of Arthur earlier in the evening, correcting the fire, checking figures, deciding who should hold keys and when money should be released. He had been a man accustomed to arranging the world around him. Such men frequently produced grievances without intending to produce enemies. One more question, I said. Before Hugh went in to speak to him, was your father already troubled? Margaret answered immediately. Yes. Because of the accounts. I assumed so. She paused. Actually, before dinner it was the letter. The one Paris brought him. Yes. Her eyes narrowed as memory settled into place. He had been looking through the accounts already, but after he opened that envelope, he changed. Hugh had not asked him for money yet. They had not quarreled. She looked from me to her brother. Whatever was worrying father tonight had begun before Hugh ever went into that room. It was shortly after midnight when Mrs. Pym announced that the dining room could not remain, as it was merely because Arthur Latham was dead. She did not put the matter quite so coldly. The cloth ought to come off, she said. Elsie has been waiting to clear it for 2 hours, and staring at dirty plates will do none of us any good. I thought she was right. There was something almost merciful in allowing the ordinary machinery of the inn to continue. We moved with her from the public parlour into the dining room, where the remains of dinner had already lost their earlier importance. The lamps had been turned lower. The chairs stood at uneven angles where people had left them. A basket of bread remained beneath its folded napkin. Elsie began collecting glasses while Mrs. Pym folded the cloth from one end. Carrick stood near the sideboard. "You wanted to speak to me," he said. "I wanted you to speak accurately. That is a more expensive service." Mrs. Pym gave him a look as she carried a stack of plates away. Carrick waited until she had gone. "The matter between Arthur and me was money. So I gathered £250. He said it with the reluctance of a man who disliked not the debt itself, but the necessity of discussing it. "We invested jointly in a parcel of land some years ago. I believed it would be sold quickly. It was not. Arthur paid certain charges which ought partly to have been mine. And he wanted repayment." "Yes. You implied at dinner that the delay was temporary." "I hoped it was." "Was it?" Carrick looked at the empty place where Arthur had sat. "Not as temporary as I allowed him to believe. That, I thought, accounted for the careful formality between them. You concealed the extent of your difficulty. I concealed my embarrassment. There is a difference." "Frequently." He gave me a dry glance. "I was in the public room for most of the period after dinner. I went upstairs once for my case and spent perhaps 5 minutes in my room. If you require a more heroic alibi, I cannot provide one. I require only the truth." "That is fortunate." He helped Elsie move a chair aside before returning to the parlour. Mrs. March was not there. I found her in the writing room. She stood beside the little desk where Margaret had burned her letter earlier. A shaded lamp cast a narrow circle of light over blotting paper, envelopes, and a brass inkwell. Mrs. March had one hand resting upon the back of the chair. "You were looking for me," she said. "Yes. I thought you might." Her composure was still intact, but it had become effortful. "You told us earlier that you had lost your way after leaving the parlour." "I did." "That was untrue." "Yes." There was no point in making her work harder for the admission. She opened her handbag and removed an envelope worn pale along one edge. "I went into Mr. Latham's private room before the quarrel with his son." "What time?" "About 8:30. Perhaps a little later." "Was he there?" "No." "How did you enter?" "By the ordinary door. It was unlocked." She looked down at the envelope. "My husband and Arthur Latham were once associated in a small business venture. It ended badly. Not criminally. Merely badly enough that neither man ever forgave the other." "And this?" "A letter my husband wrote to Arthur afterward. An angry one." "Why did you want it?" "My daughter is engaged to a man whose family would find certain old accusations unpleasant. The letter proves nothing, but people have built reputations upon less." "You knew where Latham kept it?" "I knew where he had kept such papers years ago." "I looked. I found it." "And lied because you had entered the room without permission?" "Yes." "She offered me the letter." "I did not take it." "You had left the room before Hugh Latham went in?" "Long before." "And you did not return?" "No." For the first time, her voice softened. I disliked Arthur. I did not kill him. I have not said that you did. No. You have been much more inconvenient than that. I left her with the letters still in her hand. The pantry was brighter than the rooms intended for guests. Its white shelves, rows of cups and hanging cloths had a clean severity of their own. A kettle rested on the range, and the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and soap. Elsie was drying the last of the dinner cups. You made Mr. Latham's coffee tonight? Yes, sir. At the usual time. A little after 10. Did you take it to him? She stopped drying. No. Mr. Paris did. Tell me exactly. I'd put the pot and cup on the tray. Mr. Latham liked it strong, with hot milk separate if he wanted it. I was carrying it through the hall when Mr. Paris said he would take it. Was that usual? She considered. Not exactly unusual. Only usually I took it. Did he give a reason? No, sir. Mrs. Pym entered, carrying the folded dining room cloth. He was always particular about that coffee, she said. If it stood too long, we heard about it. I have heard. She placed the cloth in a press and turned the key. You also took Mr. Latham some papers before 9:30. Her hands stopped. Yes. The repair invoices. Yes. Mr. Paris had asked for them. What happened? Mrs. Pym leaned one shoulder against the linen press. I took them to Mr. Latham's door at about 9:20. Just before, perhaps. The quarter had struck not long before. He answered. He opened the door himself, took the invoices from me, and said Mr. Paris was bringing the counterfeils. He was perfectly well. Perfectly. And then I began putting away the silver. She led me from the pantry into the side passage. The tall cupboard stood opposite Arthur's ordinary door, exactly where I had seen her earlier. I was here, she said. Elsie brought the trays from the dining room. I counted everything before locking it away. She opened the cupboard to demonstrate. With both doors spread wide, she occupied almost the whole of the narrow passage. Could anyone have gone into Mr. Latham's room without passing you? Not from the hall. Did anyone? No. How long were you here? Until the half-hour struck. A little after, perhaps. She became thoughtful. There was one sound. What sort? A heavy thump. Then the brass fender scraping. When? A few minutes before 9:30. Did you investigate? No. Mr. Latham was forever shifting something by the hearth. I thought he'd knocked the poker or moved a log. She frowned. I suppose now. For the moment, I said, suppose nothing. She accepted that. I turned toward the narrow service passage beyond the pantry. The other door into his room. The new lock. Mrs. Pym nodded. Burford locksmith fitted it 7 weeks ago. 2 keys came with it. I was there. Who received them? Mr. Latham kept one. He gave the other to Mr. Paris. No staff copy. I asked for one. And Mr. Latham said there was no need. You are certain only 2 were supplied? I watched the locksmith put them both on the table. His invoice should still be in the maintenance file. And since then, if that door needed unlocking, we fetched Mr. Latham or Mr. Paris. She gave the lock a mildly offended glance. Which is why I remember it. I thought of the small key already found among Arthur Latham's possessions. I did not yet say what any of it meant. From somewhere beyond the pantry came the gentle ticking of the service clock, a little faster than the solemn hall clock and therefore slightly out of agreement with it. Elsie resumed drying cups. Mrs. Pym folded another cloth. The Fox and Lantern went quietly about the business of midnight. And amid those ordinary routines, the evening had begun to acquire a firmer shape. At 1:45, I returned to Arthur Latham's private parlour. Mrs. Pym had placed a clean cloth over the back of one chair, though no one had asked her to do so. It was a small act, almost certainly unconscious, and I found it characteristic of the inn. Disorder, even the disorder produced by death, was something the Fox and Lantern resisted by habit. Carrick came with me. Margaret remained in the public room with Hugh and Mrs. March. Paris had withdrawn to the little office behind the booking desk to deal with some practical matter concerning the guests. I had asked only that no one leave the building, which under the circumstances of the night required little enforcement. The private parlour had cooled. Not greatly, but enough that the excessive heat of an hour before was now easier to judge. I stood beside Arthur's chair and looked again at the coffee tray. Suppose, I said, we stop asking when this was brought. Carrick leaned against the writing table. What do we ask instead? What does it prove? That someone made coffee. Precisely. He regarded me for a moment. And that it was brought here while still warm. Yes. Not that Arthur drank it. The cup remained where we had first seen it, untouched. I nodded. Nor even that he was alive when it arrived. Carrick glanced toward the body. So you are moving the death backwards. I am allowing it to move. There was a distinction, though perhaps not a large one. I turned to the cigar. Earlier, Arthur had prepared his own with almost fussy care. This cigar had been cut squarely, lit, and then scarcely smoked. A man may change his habits, Carrick said. He may. And he may allow someone else to cut a cigar. He may. You dislike easy answers. I distrust answers which require several small changes of character on the same evening. Carrick folded his arms. That at least he accepted. Next came the watch. Its cracked face still indicated approximately 12 minutes past 10. I did not touch it. The chain is intact, I said. We established that. And the ring upon the watch is intact. Yes. So it did not tear loose when he fell. Carrick looked at the chain, then at the watch. He might have removed it earlier. He might. But then the stopped time becomes less useful. Exactly. A clock was a splendid witness when one knew why it had stopped. Otherwise, it was merely a machine which had ceased working. I walked to the hearth. The brass fender remained displaced. Ash lay in pale drifts behind it, and one of the logs, which had been fresh, when we found Arthur, had now broken into two glowing sections. Mrs. Pym's remark returned to me. Far too high. Arthur disliked overheated rooms. Carrick had confirmed it. Yet the fire had been built strongly enough that the private parlour had been close and heavy when the body was discovered. Heat, Carrick said, following my thoughts, would delay cooling. Yes. Not indefinitely. No. But enough to make a casual estimate misleading. I looked at him. And you wisely refused to make one. I am becoming attached to my own prudence. I moved away from the hearth. Coffee. Cigar. Watch. Fire. 4 indications of recent life. Not one of them, considered carefully, required Arthur Latham to have been alive at 10 minutes past 10. That did not yet tell me when he had died. But Mrs. Pym had supplied something better than the room's theatrical little collection of suggestions. She had seen Arthur alive shortly before 20 past 9. Then, while stationed opposite his ordinary door, she had heard the heavy sound from within shortly before 1:30. Carrick had already told me that the blow would have caused immediate collapse. I said, "Come with me." We left the parlour by the ordinary door. The side passage was empty. The silver cupboard stood closed now, its brass keyhole catching the light from a wall lamp. I took the position Mrs. Pym had demonstrated earlier. From there, the arrangement was plain. Arthur's door lay only a few feet away. Anyone approaching it from the hall would have passed directly before her. I walked to the public parlour. The chess table had been returned to its former position, though the pieces were boxed. I sat in the chair I had occupied during the game. From there, I could see the mouth of the side passage. Not every inch of Arthur's door itself, but enough of the approach that anyone coming from the public rooms towards it would have crossed my view. Carrick stood where Hugh had sat. You remember the whole game. I remember losing a bishop. Hugh lost the bishop. Then my memory is improving. I smiled. Hugh was here continuously. Yes. And from shortly after 10, until Margaret discovered her father, I remember no one crossing toward Arthur's room by the ordinary route. Carrick looked towards the passage. Paris took the coffee. He did. So did someone else carry it farther? I don't know. He understood the warning in my tone and did not pursue it. We walked through the pantry instead. The kitchen range had been banked for the night. A covered bowl of dough stood beneath a cloth for the morning bread. Cups had been arranged upside down along one shelf, and a row of polished spoons dried upon another. Beyond lay the narrow service passage. It was not mysterious. That was perhaps its most important quality. No concealed panels. No priest's holes. No theatrical architecture. Merely an old working corridor, narrow enough that 2 people would have needed to turn sideways to pass comfortably, connecting the pantry with the private parlour. I walked its length. At the far end stood the service door with its recently fitted lock. I did not attempt to open it. Not yet. Instead, I retraced my steps, measuring the short journey naturally with my pace. A person could go from the pantry to Arthur's room in well under a minute. Carrick remained at the pantry end. So we have another entrance. We have always had another entrance. That sounds deliberately irritating. It is merely accurate. The existence of a door told me very little until I knew who could use it, when, and under what circumstances. I returned to the public parlour. Hugh had taken a book from the shelf, but was not reading it. Margaret sat at the small writing table, making a list of matters which would need attention when the road became passable. Mrs. March had accepted a cup of cocoa from Elsie and held it between both hands. They looked up when I entered. Hugh spoke first. "Well, there is one thing I can tell you." He closed the book. "I no longer believe your father's watch tells us when he died." The relief that crossed his face lasted less than a second. Then he understood. "If he died earlier." "Yes. My game with you proves nothing." "Not necessarily nothing. But I could have done it." No one answered. Hugh looked down at the book in his hands. The room had changed again, though no one had moved. The impossible suspect was possible once more. Yet that was not the conclusion which interested me most. Someone had taken pains to make Arthur Latham appear alive after he was dead. The question was no longer how Hugh could have killed his father while sitting opposite me at chess. It was why someone had wanted us to believe that he had. At a little after 1, Margaret brought me the keys to her father's desk. She had found them where he ordinarily kept them, upon a narrow hook inside the small cabinet behind the booking desk. She placed them in my palm without ceremony. "If there is anything in his papers which matters, you had better find it." We were standing in the writing room. Someone had brought in a fresh lamp and trimmed the wick, so that the desk, blotting pad and brass letter rack stood sharply defined, while the corners of the room remained in shadow. Margaret had been making notes there earlier. Her list lay folded beneath a paperweight. "Are you certain?" I asked. "No." That answer was more honest than permission usually is. She looked towards the door. "But I am certain that father would rather have his private affairs examined than have Hugh accused of killing him, because everyone was too delicate to open a drawer." I returned the keys to my pocket. "That is sufficient." Arthur's private parlour had cooled considerably by then. Carrick came with me, though he took no active part. Margaret remained outside. Paris was occupied with Mrs. Pym in arranging rooms for those who would now certainly remain until morning, and Hugh had gone upstairs briefly to wash and change his collar. The practical arrangements of a country inn persisted even in the presence of murder. A bedroom still required linen. A kettle still required filling. A guest who had expected to leave still required somewhere to sleep. I found something reassuring in the refusal of such necessities to become dramatic. Arthur's writing table stood much as we had left it. The upper drawer opened with the second key. Inside was stationery, sealing wax, 2 checkbooks, a bundle of receipts secured with tape, and an orderly collection of correspondence. The lower drawer contained ledgers. I carried them to the table one at a time. "I hope," Carrick said, "that you understand accounts. Enough to know when a man has tried to make them incomprehensible." That sounds nearly professional. It is merely experience. Arthur's own books were meticulous. Dates, suppliers and payments had been entered in a firm, narrow hand. Against several September repairs, he had placed small pencil marks in the margin. The same marks appeared beside entries for plumbing work in June, stable roofing in April, and coal deliveries from the previous winter. None was large. That was the first interesting thing about them. A man stealing £600 at once leaves a wound. A man removing it in small amounts over time may leave only irritation. Carrick pulled another chair nearer. Anything? Possibly. I showed him 2 entries. One concerned repairs to a chimney stack. The amount entered in the ledger was greater than the figure upon the builder's receipt. Another payment appeared to have been entered twice under slightly different descriptions. Carrick frowned. Could be clerical. One could. And several could still be clerical. You are determined not to accuse anyone tonight. I am determined to have something better than arithmetic before I do. He leaned back. I continued. The September file contained the repair invoices Mrs. Pym had delivered to Arthur shortly before his death. One invoice had been folded lengthwise and marked with a blue pencil. Beside it lay a bank counterful for an amount which did not correspond exactly with the ledger entry. The discrepancy was not enormous. It was merely wrong. That difference mattered. I found 3 more. The pattern began to emerge slowly enough that I distrusted it less for doing so. Payments had been enlarged. Expenses had been duplicated. Small sums had passed through the books beneath descriptions sufficiently ordinary to escape casual attention. Arthur had noticed. The marks in the margin were his trail through them. Carrick said, "Who kept these books?" Paris handled most of the detailed accounts. He was silent for a moment. That gives him access. Yes. Not guilt. No. I turned another page. Someone else might have altered figures before Paris entered them. Arthur himself might have misunderstood an account. A supplier might have submitted false invoices. Even an apparently clear pattern could acquire a different shape once all the papers were present. Suspicion is useful only so long as one remembers that it is not proof. The fire had sunk almost entirely to embers. I rose to move the screen nearer the hearth, and as I did so, something pale showed behind the displaced fender. At first, I took it for ash. Then I saw a straight edge. I crouched. A narrow piece of paper had slipped between the iron foot of the fender and the stonework. Most of it was charred black, but the protected end had survived. Carrick handed me the fireplace tongs. I drew the fragment out carefully and laid it upon an empty sheet of writing paper. Only a few lines remained legible. The printed heading belonged to a bank in Burford. Below it were fragments of a sentence concerning irregularities in deposits credited to the Fox and Lantern. One name survived near the lower edge. Not a signature. A reference. Mr. E. Paris. Carrick read it over my shoulder. That is less clerical. Yes. The letter Arthur had opened before dinner had carried a printed return address. I remembered the stillness that had come over him after reading it. The concern had preceded Hugh's quarrel. That fact, which Margaret had already given me, now possessed a possible cause. I examined the hearth. The fire, which had seemed unnecessarily strong when the body was discovered, had also been perfectly capable of destroying paper. Most of this letter had been destroyed. A small part had escaped. I did not yet know whether Arthur had burned it himself, whether another person had done so, or precisely when it had entered the grate. I was unwilling to improve the evidence merely because it had become interesting. "There's more," I said. On the blotting pad lay the upper sheet of a small memorandum block. The page itself had been removed, but Arthur's hard pencil had left an impression beneath it. I shifted the lamp and read the indentations obliquely. Only part of the message could be made out. Paris Counterfoils, September repairs after dinner. Carrick gave a quiet breath. So he summoned him. It would appear so. You heard the bell yourself. Yes. And Paris went to fetch the books. Yes. That much was no longer uncertain. Arthur had discovered discrepancies. The surviving bank letter connected those discrepancies with Paris. Arthur had requested the relevant papers. And shortly afterward, Paris had gone to him. I closed the ledger. The sequence was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Yet one difficulty remained which no balance sheet could solve. Money might explain why someone wished Arthur Latham dead. It did not explain who had entered his room, when, or how the contradictory evidence around his death had been arranged. I gathered the papers into their original order and placed the burned fragments separately beneath a clean sheet. As I did so, I looked once more at the hearth. The fierce fire had warmed the room. It had helped make Arthur's death appear recent. And it had nearly consumed the letter which explained why someone might have wanted him dead. For the first time, I wondered whether those two conveniences had belonged to the same intention. I was not yet prepared to say whose. By 2 o'clock the Fox and Lantern had entered that peculiar hour when even familiar rooms seemed to belong chiefly to those who worked in them. The public rooms were still occupied, but the life of the inn had withdrawn towards its passages and cupboards. Lamps had been lowered where they were no longer needed. A tray of unused cups waited upon the sideboard. Somewhere upstairs a board creaked beneath an unseen footstep, then was still. I asked Mrs. Pym to walk through her evening with me. She did not appear surprised. "If we are to do it," she said, "we had better do it properly." We began beside the silver cupboard. She opened its doors and stood exactly where she had stood after dinner. At 9:15, I was fetching the last of the silver from the dining room. A few minutes later, I took Mr. Latham the repair invoices. "You are certain of the time?" The hall clock had struck the quarter before I went to the file. It had not reached the half hour when I finished here. She pointed towards Arthur's door. "He opened that himself." "Yes, he took the papers from me. Said Mr. Paris was bringing the counterfoils. And you came directly here?" "Directly." She stepped back into position. The passage was narrow enough that her explanation required no imagination. With the cupboard doors open behind her and the trays of silver before her, she occupied the only convenient line between the hall and Arthur's ordinary entrance. I walked from the hall towards the private parlour. To reach the door, I had to pass within 2 feet of her. There is no other approach from this side. Not unless someone came through a wall. And you remained here continuously. I had the better silver laid out. Her expression suggested that abandoning it would have been a greater breach of discipline than murder. Elsie brought me the final tray. I counted every piece before locking the cupboard. When did you hear the noise? She considered, not trying to improve her memory. A few minutes before the half-hour. A thump first. Then the fender or something metal along the hearth. No voices. None that I noticed. No one came out. No. The hall clock stood only a short distance away. I opened its lower case and examined the pendulum. Has it kept good time? Mrs. Pym looked almost offended. Mr. Latham checked it every Sunday against the wireless. Carrick, who had joined us, took out his watch. It is less than a minute slow now. That was sufficient. The sound Mrs. Pym had heard could not be placed to a second, nor did I require it to be. Arthur had been alive when she spoke to him shortly before 9:20. Within the next 10 minutes, she had heard a heavy fall and the scrape of the displaced fender. Carrick had already established that the blow would have produced immediate collapse. The interval was becoming narrow without assistance from Arthur's broken watch. We went into the private parlour. The fender remained as we had found it. Carrick crouched beside the hearth. The position is perfectly consistent, he said. If he fell where we found him, his weight could have shifted the end of it. Could he have received the blow and remained conscious? Not on the evidence I have seen. No. I looked once more at the ordinary door behind us. Mrs. Pym had been outside it. No one had passed her. The courtyard window remained the second possibility. I drew the curtain aside without touching the latch. The exterior sill still carried its damp, even coating. Under the lamp, I could make out no broad smear where a hand or shoe had crossed it, no clean patch where the sash had been raised against wet stone. Carrick examined the frame. No damage, nor to the latch. An intruder from the courtyard would have required the window to be opened and closed again in a fog thick enough to soak every exposed surface. Nothing suggested that it had been. That left the narrow door beside the hearth. Mrs. Pym led us back through the pantry to the service passage. The small passage smelled faintly of starch, coffee, and the cold stone hidden beneath the boards. At one side stood a shelf of folded service cloths. At the other, pegs held 2 aprons and an old lantern. The door at the end showed no splintering around the jamb and no scoring near the lock. I examined the newer brass fitting. Have you the locksmith's invoice? Mrs. Pym nodded. In the maintenance file. Margaret brought it from the office a few minutes later. The paper was ordinary enough. The name of a Burford locksmith, a date 7 weeks earlier, and several repairs listed beneath one another. The final line read, Private parlour service, door new mortise lock fitted. 2 keys supplied. Mrs. Pym read over my shoulder. That is the one. You saw the keys delivered. I did. Mr. Latham kept one and handed the second to Mr. Parris. I asked if I was to have another cut. He said no. And since then, if I needed the door opened, I fetched one of them. No occasion on which another member of staff used a key. None. I had Arthur's personal effects brought from the private parlour. Among the keys from his waistcoat was a small brass one. Mrs. Pym identified it. I tested it in the service door. The bolt moved cleanly. Then I asked Paris for his managerial ring. He handed it to me without protest. There should be a smaller brass key near the ledger cupboard key, he said. There was. I tried it. The same lock turned. I returned the ring to him. Thank you. Paris looked from the door to the invoice. Is there some doubt about the lock? There is doubt about almost everything at present. He accepted that and went back towards the public rooms. His composure neither cleared nor condemned him. Locks possess no morality. Keys do not explain the intentions of the people carrying them. But they do limit possibilities. On our way back through the entrance hall, Elsie was gathering the last glasses from a tray. She paused beside the umbrella stand. Then she frowned. So, yes, that cane. Hugh's silver-headed Malacca cane was no longer there, of course, but her eyes remained on the place where it had stood. I remembered something. I waited. After Mr. Hugh came out from speaking with his father, Mr. Paris was there. By the stand. You saw him take the cane. No, sir. She answered quickly. I wouldn't say that. I saw him handling the sticks. I thought he was straightening them because one umbrella had fallen sideways. Did you see the silver-headed cane in his hand? I saw the silver head move. I cannot swear to more than that. That is exactly what I wanted you to say. She seemed relieved. I left her to the glasses. In the public parlour, the others had settled into a silence which no longer resembled waiting so much as exhaustion. I stood near the empty chess table and considered the two intervals. Before 9:30, Arthur was alive and then suddenly fell. His ordinary door had not been used. The window bore no evidence of passage. Later, shortly after 10, fresh coffee reached his room, the fire was built up, a cigar was lighted, and the watch was arranged to suggest a later death. During much of that period, I had been sitting where I could see the approach to the ordinary door. Again, the same alternative entrance remained. Again, the same lock. Again, the same two keys. There was now a theory strong enough to withstand suspicion. What remained was to state it in such a way that nothing depended upon temperament, appearance, or confession. Margaret looked up from her chair. Have you found something? Yes. I looked around the quiet parlour. Would you ask everyone to remain here for a little while longer? Her expression changed. You know, I thought of the coffee, the altered cigar, the displaced fender, the two keys, the burned letter, and a silver-headed cane lifted from an entrance hall stand. Yes, I said. I believe I do. No one spoke when I asked them to remain. Mrs. Pym had brought a fresh pot of tea into the parlour and left it upon the side table with cups beside it. No one had yet poured any. The room had the subdued appearance of a place being kept awake beyond its proper hour. newspapers folded away, lamps turned modestly down, cushions slightly displaced by too many changes of occupant. Hugh sat beside Margaret. Carrick stood near the mantelpiece. Mrs. March had taken the chair nearest the bookcase. Paris remained by the doorway. I did not ask him to move. The difficulty, I said, has always been Hugh. He looked at me. Not because the evidence against him was weak, because it was remarkably strong. Margaret's hand closed over her brother's. Hugh quarrelled with his father. He needed money. He smoked in the private parlour. His cigarette ash remained there. And the object beside Arthur's body was Hugh's own cane. Hugh said quietly, "All true." "Yes." I looked around the room. But at approximately 12 minutes past 10, Hugh was sitting opposite me at chess. Carrick nodded. He never left. No. Which produced an apparent impossibility. Either Hugh had somehow killed his father without leaving his chair, or Arthur Latham did not die when the room suggested that he did. I paused. The second explanation is the correct one. Paris's face did not change. I continued. The watch was the first weakness. Its chain had not broken. The watch itself had not broken away from its fastening. It had been detached. Carrick said, and therefore could have been set before it was damaged. Yes. I turned slightly toward the side passage. The coffee seemed to support the watch. It was still warm when Arthur was found. But warm coffee proves only that coffee was recently brought into a room. It does not prove that the man for whom it was intended was alive to drink it. Mrs. Pym glanced toward Paris, then lowered her eyes. The cigar presented the same difficulty. Arthur had a particular habit of cutting his cigars. We saw him do it before dinner. The cigar beside him had been cut differently and scarcely smoked at all. Mrs. March said softly, "Someone lit it. Someone wanted it to appear that Arthur had." I let that settle before going on. And the fire had been built much higher than Arthur liked. It made the room excessively warm. Dr. Carrick therefore refused correctly to estimate the time of death from the body's warmth. Carrick inclined his head. "The fire did something else," I said. "It almost destroyed a bank letter." Paris moved his hand from the back of one chair to the other. I did not look at him. The apparent time of death, 10:12, was not discovered. It was constructed. Hugh leaned forward. "Then when did father die?" "Shortly before 9:30. Margaret stared at me. Mrs. Pym saw him alive at about 19 minutes past. He opened his door himself and took the repair invoices from her. Mrs. Pym nodded. I then remained at the silver cupboard directly opposite his door. No one could have reached that ordinary entrance from the hall without passing me. And a few minutes before 9:30, I said, she heard a heavy impact and the scrape of the hearth fender. Arthur was later found beside that displaced fender. Dr. Carrick established that the blow would have caused immediate collapse. Carrick said there is no reason to suppose he survived it. So we have a narrow interval. Arthur was alive at about 9:19. He received the fatal blow before 9:30. Hugh's face had gone very still. And I had already left him. Yes. But whoever killed him didn't use the main door. No. I turned towards the blank doorway of the side passage. Nor the window. Its latch was fastened, the frame undamaged, and the dampness outside showed no sign of anyone passing across the sill. Mrs. March looked towards the service rooms. The other door. The service door. Paris spoke at last. That proves someone used it. Not who. No, I said. Not by itself. His voice remained level. The servants have known that passage for years. They have, but not that lock. Silence followed. It was fitted 7 weeks ago. We have the locksmith's invoice. 2 keys were supplied. Mrs. Pym said Mr. Latham kept one. And Mr. Paris received the other, I said. Paris looked at her. You asked for a staff copy, I continued. Arthur refused. In the 7 weeks since, whenever the door required unlocking, the household fetched either Arthur or Paris. Arthur's key was found on his body. Paris's key remains upon his managerial ring. Both have been tested in the lock. The door shows no forced entry. Paris's expression tightened slightly. Arthur might have admitted someone himself. Through the service door. He might. Then Mrs. Pym would still have heard nothing at the ordinary entrance, certainly. But Arthur had just told her that you were bringing the counterfoils. You admit going to him with them. I do. At precisely the period in which he died. Paris said nothing. That alone would still leave room for uncertainty, I continued. Unfortunately, the room had to be entered twice. His eyes met mine then. The first entry was before 9:30, when Arthur was killed. The second was shortly after 10, when someone brought fresh coffee, built up the fire, lit the cigar, and arranged the watch. Elsie stood near the hall archway. She looked down. I prepared the coffee, she said. Yes. And Mr. Paris took it. Paris replied immediately. I have never denied that. No. Nor does taking coffee prove murder. I spoke as quietly as before. But during that later interval, I was sitting with Hugh, where I could see the approach to Arthur's ordinary door. No one carried that tray to him by that route. The window was still unused. The service door was required a second time. No one moved. The same unseen route was necessary at both crucial moments. The same recently fitted lock controlled it. Arthur's key never left his body. I turned to Paris. You possessed the other. He drew a slow breath. You have motive still to prove. I have not forgotten it. I crossed to the table where I had placed the papers from Arthur's desk. The accounts contained small irregularities extending over nearly 2 years. Inflated repairs, duplicate expenses, banking discrepancies. Arthur had begun marking them. I lifted the charred fragment. This survived behind the hearth fender. It is part of the bank letter Arthur received before dinner. His concern began before Hugh asked him for money. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. The surviving portion refers directly to irregular deposits connected with you, I said. And the impression upon Arthur's memorandum pad records his intention to see you after dinner concerning the September repairs and counterfalls. Paris's face had become pale. You went to him. He told you the matter could no longer be concealed. He intended to involve the bank and his solicitor in the morning. That is supposition. The motive is inference, I said. The access is not. He looked away. And Hugh's cane, Carrick asked. Paris had just watched Hugh leave after a public quarrel. The canes stood in the hall. Elsie saw Paris handling the stand immediately afterward. She saw the silver head move, though she cannot honestly swear that she saw him remove it. I looked at Hugh. The weapon and the cigarette ash were not invented evidence. They were genuine traces of you, used to make the wrong story appear obvious. Hugh said nothing. Paris remained standing for several seconds. Then he crossed to an empty chair and sat. The movement seemed to age him. I thought, he said eventually, that the quarrel would be enough. No one interrupted. The money began as borrowing. I meant to replace it. Then there was always another amount to cover the last. He looked at his hands. When he showed me the bank letter, I knew it was finished. Margaret's voice was barely audible. So you killed him. Paris closed his eyes. Yes. There was no triumph in hearing it. Only the final removal of uncertainty. Outside, the night remained hidden beyond the walls of the Fox and Lantern, and for a little while none of us spoke at all. It was after 3 when Mrs. Pym finally poured the tea. Until then, the pot had remained untouched upon the side table, cooling beneath its knitted cover while we sat with the knowledge of what had happened among us. When she rose at last, she did so without announcement. I shall make another, she said. No one objected. Paris had been taken to the small office behind the booking desk, where Carrick agreed to remain within call. There was nowhere for him to go in any case. The road beyond the inn was still lost in fog, and the telephone line, when Margaret tried it, produced only a distant crackle before falling silent. The authorities would come when the countryside permitted them to do so. For the present, the Fox and Lantern was sufficient. Mrs. Pym returned from the kitchen with a fresh pot, a loaf of bread, and a jar of marmalade. Margaret looked at the tray. At this hour? At any hour, Mrs. Pym said, people require feeding. She began cutting the bread. There was something so absolute in her conviction that no one thought of disagreeing. Elsie had disappeared upstairs and returned with her sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. Without being asked, she collected the cups which had stood forgotten since before midnight and replaced them with clean ones. She straightened the small tables, rescued a cushion from beneath Carrick's abandoned newspaper, and carried away an ashtray which had long ceased to be of use to anyone. The work was quiet and unhurried. The inn was putting itself back in order. Hugh remained beside the empty hearthrug, looking down at nothing in particular. I carried him a cup. He accepted it. Thank you. For several minutes, we stood together without speaking. At length he said, the last thing I did was quarrel with him. I could have told him that last conversations are seldom designed to become last conversations. Instead, I waited. I had rehearsed what I meant to say tomorrow, he continued. It was much more reasonable. That is often the advantage of tomorrow. He looked at me. A faint expression passed across his face, not amusement exactly, but recognition of the absurdity. "I suppose it is." He drank some tea. He would still have said no. Probably. That time the shadow of a smile did appear. Then it was gone. I was angry with him. Yes. I loved him as well. I know. There seemed no need to improve upon that. Across the room, Margaret had opened the inn's ledger. She sat at Arthur's usual desk, though not in his chair. That she had avoided. Instead, she had pulled across a smaller one and was working through the practical necessities of the next few hours. Mrs. Pym approached her. "You needn't do that tonight." "I do." "Your father would have left it until morning." Margaret looked up. "No, he wouldn't." Mrs. Pym considered this. "No," she admitted. "He wouldn't." They bent over the book together. There were guests to account for, rooms unexpectedly occupied, breakfast quantities to alter, a delivery which might or might not reach them through the fog, and arrangements which would have to be made once the telephone returned. They dealt with these things one at a time. Grief did not diminish because sheets required changing or bread required ordering. Nor did work diminish because grief had entered the house. Carrick returned from the office and took the chair Hugh had vacated. "He is quiet," he said to me. I nodded. "I'll remain down here." "You have already postponed going home once." Carrick glanced towards the curtained entrance. "I think the road has postponed it more effectively than I ever could." Mrs. Pym put a plate before him. He looked at the bread. "Is this a medical instruction?" "It is now." He ate it. By degrees, the company dispersed. Mrs. March went upstairs first. Before leaving, she stopped beside Margaret and rested a hand briefly upon her shoulder. No elaborate condolence passed between them. Hugh remained until his tea was cold, then carried the cup himself to the tray. "I think I'll sit with Margaret a while." "That seems sensible." He crossed the room. Brother and sister spoke quietly. I could not hear the words and made no attempt to do so. At the entrance hall, Elsie had begun arranging the walking sticks and umbrellas which had been disturbed during the evening. There was now an empty place among them where Hugh's Malacca cane had stood. She noticed me looking. I thought I ought to straighten everything. "Yes." Her hand lingered on the rim of the stand. "Will it ever feel ordinary again?" I considered the question. "Not immediately." She nodded. "But eventually. Places are rather stubborn." That appeared to satisfy her. Upstairs, Mrs. Pym had left fresh towels outside 2 guest rooms and a folded blanket upon the landing chair. The sight of them affected me more than I expected. There was generosity in such ordinary preparation. The Fox and Lantern had been interrupted, but not defeated. I paused at the landing window. The fog was still there. It no longer seemed pressed tightly against the glass. Somewhere beyond it, perhaps, the darkness had softened by a degree too small to call morning. The yard remained invisible. The road was still only an idea running past the inn. I was glad of it. Daylight would have been too definite. At my door, I heard Margaret below giving Mrs. Pym some instruction concerning breakfast. Mrs. Pym contradicted her. Margaret contradicted Mrs. Pym. The exchange was quiet, practical, and strangely familiar. Arthur's absence could already be felt within it. It would be felt for a long time. I entered number 7. Someone had been there while I was downstairs. The bed had been turned back. The water jug had been refilled. A hot water bottle lay beneath the blankets, and beside the chair stood a small plate containing 2 slices of bread and butter under a cloth. I suspected Mrs. Pym. On the writing table lay the book I had noticed upon arrival. I had imagined then that I might spend several peaceful days reading it. The optimism seemed considerable now. I removed my coat and sat for a moment beside the low warmth of the grate. There was nothing left to solve. Below me, the Fox and Lantern settled gradually around its occupants, not unchanged and certainly not untouched, but still itself. Beyond the curtains, the dense country fog continued to hide the valley, the hedgerows, and the road by which I had arrived. For a few more hours, at least, the world could remain outside. I drew the blankets over me and let the inn keep the rest of the night.